it was generally a better idea.
Yeah.
So you'd give in to each other.
Yeah.
When you think of Paul McCartney, you probably picture the charming, boyish Beatle with a melodic bass line and a friendly wave. You see the global icon who gave us Yesterday and Let It Be, the man knighted by the Queen, an artist, who has spent 60 years as a symbol of pop perfection. He is, by pretty much every measure, one of the most beloved figures in modern history. But behind that knighthood and the thumbs up, there's a man with razor-sharp opinions, fierce artistic convictions, and a competitive fire that helped write the rules of rock and roll. The story of music has always been about collaboration, sure, but it's also a story of conflict, ego, and rivalry. Now, that title. It suggests that Sir Paul, at 82, just dropped a hit list of bands he hated. So let's get one thing straight, right away. That never happened. Hate is way too simple, too blunt for a man who has built his life on nuance and melody. He's never sat down and dictated a list of his musical enemies, but to say he loved everyone and everything would be to strip him of his humanity. Over the decades, through candid interviews, off-the-cuff remarks, and what his friends and rivals have said about him, a picture emerges of a man who knew exactly what he liked, and maybe more importantly, what he didn't. He held other artists to the same impossibly high standard he set for himself, and he wasn't afraid to notice when they fell short. So today, we aren't looking at some mythical hate list. We're doing something far more interesting. We are exploring the 6 most significant and complex rivalries of Paul McCartney's career. These are the relationships defined by creative friction, by playground taunts between rock royalty, and by deep disagreements about what music should even be. This isn't a story of hate. It's a story of passion, competition, and the untold tensions that shaped a legend. Our first entry is probably the most famous rivalry in music history. The Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. It was a story cooked, up by the press in the 60s, and honestly, both bands were happy to play along. It gave the kids a simple choice. Were you a good boy Beatle fan or a bad boy Stones fan? Did you prefer the pop perfection of I Want to Hold Your Hand or the gritty snarl of Satisfaction? On the surface, it was all friendly. The Beatles even gave the Stones one of their first hits, I Wanna Be Your Man. They hung out, they respected each other, they were two bands on the same surreal rocket ship to the top of the world. But bubbling just underneath was a serious competitive streak, especially between the two bands' chief songwriters. For decades, McCartney played the diplomat. But in a killer 2021 interview with The New Yorker at age 79, he finally laid his cards on the table. When asked about the Stones, he paused and delivered a line that was both loving and absolutely brutal. I'm not sure I should say it, he started, but they're a blues cover band. That's sort of what the Stones are. That comment sent little shockwaves through the music world, but Paul explained himself. In his view, the Beatles' musical toolbox was just bigger. I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs, he said. He was talking about the complex harmonies they borrowed from classical music, the wild studio experiments, all the different instruments they used. He saw the Stones as masters of a style, while the Beatles were inventors of new ones. This wasn't some random jab. It was a belief he'd held for a lifetime. He saw himself and his bandmates as true pioneers, pushing the pop song into bizarre new places with albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. He saw the Stones as brilliant, sure, but as followers. He once joked about their psychedelic album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, which many saw as a direct answer to Sgt. Pepper's, quipping that the Stones started to do a bit of psychedelic, but they did it very badly. Of course, the Stones gave as good as they got. Keith Richards famously dismissed Paul's softer songs as granny music. This wasn't just an insult. It was a direct shot at McCartney's love for a beautiful melody, something Keith saw as soft, lacking the dangerous edge of real rock and roll. And that's the whole dynamic right there. It wasn't personal hatred. In that same interview, Paul was quick to add, I've always been in love with them. It was a rivalry of artistic philosophy. Paul, the master of melody, looked at the Stones and saw brilliant traditionalists. The Stones, the picture of raw rebellion, looked at Paul and saw a pop writer who sometimes forgot to rock. They were two kings in the same kingdom, and each quietly believed his claim to the throne was just a little stronger. If the rivalry with the Stones was a neighborhood brawl for the soul of British rock, the competition with the Beach Boys was a transatlantic chess match between two of the greatest musical minds of the century, Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson. This wasn't a fight fueled by insults, but by a crazy high level of mutual respect and a desperate need to outdo the other. It all kicked off in the mid-60s. The Beatles had conquered the world, but back in California, Brian Wilson was cooking up a response. That response was the 1966 masterpiece, Pet Sounds. This wasn't just a record about girls and cars, it was a symphonic, sad, and beautiful album that completely changed the game for what a studio could do. For Paul McCartney, hearing Pet Sounds was a lightning bolt. He has spent the rest of his life acting as the album's #1 cheerleader. He has said flat out that the song God Only Knows is the single greatest song ever written. He would play the album for the other Beatles, over and over telling them, "See, this is the standard. We have to beat this. You cannot overstate the influence of Pet Sounds on the Beatles." Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was a direct result of it. McCartney has always been honest about this, explaining that Sgt. Pepper's was their attempt to make something that could stand next to Brian Wilson's achievement. The lush sound, the way the tracks flowed together, the very idea of an album as one piece of art, that was all a response to the challenge from California. So where's the rivalry? It was in that creative one-upmanship. It was a friendly, but deadly serious competition between two geniuses at the absolute peak of their powers. Paul didn't hate the Beach Boys. He was obsessed with them. He was driven by them. The friction was the immense pressure of that race. It was the time of Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper, he said. We were in a competition, and it was a friendly one. But there's a tragic layer to this story. While the Beatles were finishing Sgt. Pepper's, Brian Wilson was working on his own epic, an album called Smile. It was meant to be even bigger and more experimental than Pet Sounds. Paul even visited the studio and heard a piece of it, and by all accounts was blown away. He saw Wilson as maybe the only other guy on the planet playing the same game he was. Then it all fell apart. Under the weight of pressure, band fights, and his own mental health struggles, Brian Wilson shelved Smile. It became the most famous lost album in history. For McCartney, this wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. He saw Wilson as his only true peer in the art of pop. When Wilson retreated, the race was over. McCartney had lost his pacer. There was no one left to chase. As the 1960s ended, the pop world the Beatles had ruled over started to crack. The dream was over, and something new, something heavier, was crawling out of the wreckage. And at the front of that charge was a band that was the sonic opposite of Paul McCartney, Led Zeppelin. Where Paul's music was built on melody and charm, Zeppelin was a force of nature. They were thunderous and primal, built on bone-crushing blues, riffs, and the sheer untamed power of John Bonham's drumming. In the 70s, they weren't just a band. They were the biggest band in the world, and they represented a total shift in the sound of rock. Paul's relationship with Zeppelin's music wasn't a feud, but more of a quiet disagreement. He just didn't get it. In a later interview, he put it, with his usual honesty, admitting he was never a big fan of their music, saying it was a bit heavy for me. It was a simple statement of taste, but it revealed a huge difference in philosophy. For McCartney, the song was always king. The melody, the harmony, the clever little story, that's what music was about. Zeppelin's approach was totally different. For them, the riff, the groove, and the sheer sonic power were everything. Their music was visceral. It hit you in the gut, while Paul's songs aimed for the head and the heart. This wasn't about who was better. It was about two different visions for rock music. While Paul and his band Wings were making huge hits like Live and Let Die, Zeppelin was making 7-minute epics like Stairway to Heaven. McCartney was the master of the 3-minute pop song. Zeppelin was the master of the rock odyssey. But the respect was there. In the same breath that he'd admit to not being a fan, Paul would praise their musicianship, especially their legendary drummer. "I'm a massive fan of John Bonham's drumming," McCartney has stated. To see him on stage, it was, wow. He could separate the players from the playlist. He recognized their incredible talent, even if he didn't want to listen to the final product. The unspoken rivalry, then, was for the 70s itself. The Beatles had owned the 60s. The 70s were up for grabs. And while McCartney and Wings were huge, the decade's defining sound was the heavy rock of Zeppelin. The friction wasn't personal. It was the natural result of a titan from one era watching. The titans of the next one rise. All right, we are deep in the weeds of Paul McCartney's musical world, and the stories are only getting better. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the real history behind the headlines, do us a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We love telling these kinds of stories, and your support helps us keep digging. Now, back to Macca. If Led Zeppelin represented a new path for rock, our next band wanted to pave over that path and rebuild the old road, brick by brilliant brick. In the mid-90s, British music was completely dominated by one band, Oasis, and Oasis, more than anyone, was built on an absolute shameless worship of the Beatles. Led by the battling brothers Liam and Noel Gallagher, Oasis didn't just wear their influences on their sleeves. They wore them as full-body suits of armor. From Noel's McCartney-style hooks to Liam's John Lennon sneer, their whole vibe was a tribute to the Fab Four. And it worked. Songs like Wonderwall were global hits, and for a minute, Oasis was the biggest band on the planet. So how did Paul feel about being the object of all this adoration? Well, it was complicated. It's totally wrong to say he hated Oasis. But there was a clear sense of generational friction. The issue wasn't the praise, it was the imitation. For McCartney, a guy who spent his whole life trying to push music forward, it must have been strange to see a new generation so obsessed with recreating the past. He built his legacy on innovation. Oasis, for all their power, were revivalists. They took the Beatles' blueprint and just turned the volume up. Think about it. You're a living legend, and the biggest new band in the world sounds like a really good version of you from 30 years ago. It's flattering, sure, but it could also feel like a creative dead end for music. Was the best new thing just a louder version of the best old thing? Paul has never slammed Oasis in public, but his philosophy gives us clues. He has always valued originality above all else. He likely saw massive talent in Oasis, but maybe also felt a bit let down that they weren't taking the torch and running somewhere new with it. He passed the baton, and they just kept circling the same track he'd already built. Noel Gallagher once told a great story about meeting Paul, who listened to a new Oasis song and immediately started suggesting different chords and melodies, trying to push it somewhere else. That's Paul in a nutshell. His instinct is always to evolve. The rivalry with Oasis was unique. It was a rivalry with his own ghost. He was grappling with the weight of his own influence on a generation that sometimes seemed more interested in celebrating his past than building a new future. In the mid-70s, a musical earthquake hit London. It was loud, angry, and its main goal was the total rejection of everything Paul McCartney and his generation of rock royalty stood for. It was punk rock, and its goal was to burn the old kingdom to the ground. At the center of it all were the Sex Pistols. They were musically raw, lyrically confrontational, and they sneered at the idea of polished musicianship and millionaire rock stars singing about silly love songs. Their targets were the establishment, the monarchy, and the bloated rock gods of the 70s. And there was no bigger rock god than Paul McCartney. The animosity was real. The legend goes that Sid Vicious, the Pistols bassist, ran into McCartney at a club. Seeing him, Vicious sneered, "I see you're still alive." It was a direct shot, implying Paul was irrelevant. The Pistols were literally a middle finger aimed, right at the optimistic, melodic world Paul had helped build. At first, Paul's reaction was probably disgust. Punk was the opposite of his entire musical belief system. He was a craftsman who believed in skill and beauty. Punk celebrated noise and chaos. To him, it must have felt like a giant step backward. This is the most hostile rivalry on the list because it wasn't about competition. The Sex Pistols didn't want to outsell Paul McCartney. They wanted to make him obsolete. But the story doesn't end there. To say McCartney just hated punk misses the point. Over the years, he got it. He was too smart to dismiss an entire movement forever. In his book, The Lyrics, he reflected on that era, admitting he understood the rebellion. He realized his generation had become the new establishment, and it was punk's job to tear it down. He even came to appreciate the energy and the songs. He talked about seeing the Sex Pistols live and being hit by their power. Shockingly, he later expressed admiration for their anthem, Pretty Vacant, recognizing its clever riff and raw hook. The master tunesmith could still spot a great song, even if it was wrapped in safety pins and spit. This relationship shows Paul's true musical intelligence. It started with rejection, but matured into a deep understanding. Our last stop takes us back to the 60s for a rivalry that wasn't about sound or style, but about one thing: authenticity. Before boy bands were a global machine, there was the Monkees, and the Monkees were literally a manufactured band, cast for a TV show about a wacky rock group. To Paul McCartney, this was an attack on the very idea of what a band was. The Beatles were the real deal. 4 guys from Liverpool who paid their dues in grimy clubs. They wrote their own songs, played their own instruments, and their bond was real. The Monkees, on the other hand, were nicknamed the Prefab Four. In the beginning, their hits were written by professional songwriters, and the music was played by elite session musicians. The band on TV was mostly for show. For Paul, who believed a self-contained band was sacred, this was a problem. His issue wasn't with the 4 guys themselves, but with the cynical TV executive process that created them. It felt like a cheapening of the art form, a way to cash in on the Beatlemania his band had created through blood, sweat, and tears. But the story that Paul just dismissed them is, again, too simple. The truth is more interesting. While he was critical of their fake origins, he couldn't deny the songs were good. In a 2016 Rolling Stone interview, he set the record straight. "I liked them," he said. "I thought they were good," he went on. "They had some great records. It was a good show. And that's the key. He could recognize a great pop song, no matter who wrote it. He enjoyed the Monkees for what they were, a fun TV show with a killer soundtrack. The rivalry was philosophical. It was art versus product. The Beatles were artists who became a product. The Monkees were a product designed to look like artists. To Paul, that distinction was everything. He was friendly with the Monkees personally, but he could never put them in the same league as the bands who built their destiny from the ground up. He had helped build this world, and he was protective of it. So, after this journey through 6 of Paul McCartney's biggest rivalries, the word hate doesn't really fit, does it? His career wasn't shaped by petty feuds, but by a series of passionate convictions about what music should be. The common thread isn't anger, it's a fierce commitment to a set of artistic standards. His rivalry with the Rolling Stones was about innovation over tradition. His race with the Beach Boys was for pop perfection. His disconnect from Led Zeppelin was a philosophical debate over the very sound of rock. His feelings about Oasis were a look in the mirror at his own legacy. His understanding of the Sex Pistols showed his ability to see past rebellion. And his view of the Monkees was a defense of pure authenticity. These weren't grudges, they were principles. Paul McCartney holds himself to an impossibly high standard, and he expects the same from others. That competitive fire wasn't a character flaw. It was the very engine of his genius. It's what pushed him to be better than the Stones, to top Brian Wilson, and to constantly reinvent himself for over 60 years. The charming Sir Paul is the face we all know, but the focused, critical, and fiercely competitive artist is the man who wrote the masterpieces. The two are one and the same. But now, over to you. Having heard these stories, who do you think was Paul McCartney's biggest real rival? Was it the lifelong dance with the Stones, the creative race with Brian Wilson, or was it the changing sound of music itself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.